So my first job right out of college was teaching 14 through 30-day-long mountaineering courses for Outward Bound. Our goal was climbing 13 and 14,000-foot peaks, just like Mount Snuffles. And if you think about it, Outward Bound's business model is pretty wild. Let's take a group of random, completely inexperienced strangers. Let's give them ice axes and heavy backpacks. Let's venture deep into Colorado's Rocky Mountains. And then let's tie into some ropes and climb to some pointy summits. So essentially, the customer, you, are paying them to help you face down what for many people is the hardest physical and emotional challenge of your life. Now, on one of my early courses, I had the student, let's call her Barbara, middle-aged, from the Midwest, never done anything like this before in her entire life. And we're coming down from this 13,000-foot peak, and we get to an area where the rock is really fractured. It looks sort of like this. I mean, basically, the mountain summit is a giant pile of chossy rubble. And everything Barbara touches wiggles. Every foot she places wobbles. And she freezes. I mean, she's too afraid to take another step, too afraid to even sit. She's totally paralyzed with fear. Now, as her instructor, I'm trying to help her. But I'm just 22 years old, and I have no idea what I'm doing. I mean, like none, right? So I'm throwing the kitchen sink at her. I'm dropping Martin Luther King quotes. I am doing anything I can to help this woman. And it's not working. And then the other students, they see what's going on, right? So they start coming over, and they start helping her, encouraging her, believing in her. And there, right in front of us, Barbara has this beautiful, beautiful moment where she closes her eyes, she takes and holds this deep breath, and we just see her absorb all that feedback, wrestle with her fear, and then she lets it all go. And when she opened her eyes, she was able to take a step, and then another step, and then another step, and we're all like, yeah, like cheering her on, It was absolutely incredible. So looking back, instructing for Outward Bound was this incredible teacher about the power of fear and how the right teams can help us push past limits of what we believe possible, limits that are usually self-imposed. And Barbara, I got to tell you, at the end of that course, when she came down from those mountains, she was totally transformed. She was physically fit, mentally strong, and excited to tackle any challenge that life put in front of her. And just like Barbara, when I came down from those mountains at the end, I too was transformed. Because my time with Outward Bound, teaching for them, was the first time I felt truly connected with the people around me. It was the first time I felt that what I did truly mattered. And ever since then, I've been obsessed with creating those feelings in every group I belong to, from my personal life to my professional life. But as much as I cherished my time with Outward Bound, I knew I couldn't spend my entire life up in the mountains. So the day came when I traded my ice axe for a college classroom. Now, we all know America's K-12 educational system is struggling, but higher education is too. Approximately, colleges and universities, approximately 40% of freshmen don't graduate. And in community colleges, the rates are even worse. Graduates, they're in the minority. So being in the trenches with literally thousands of students has shown me that fear helps explain why. Now, every teacher I work with has been in this situation. Every teacher I know, not just work with. You're about to hand out an exam and you ask the class, are there any questions? No hands go up. So you're like, yeah, they got this. Yet when you're grading the exams, you're like, huh? As a significant portion of the class underperforms or fails. And that's so discouraging for the teacher. So I spent so much time asking myself, why? Why aren't these students raising their hands? Why aren't they asking questions? And what I came to realize is that for many students, the answer is fear. Just like Barbara, they're anxious and hesitant to act. But instead of the mountains, they're worried about being judged and punished. Because if you stop and think about it, if you raise that hand and say, hey, teach, I don't get it, you risk the other people in that room judging you and thinking, wow, you are stupid. I mean, stop and really think about that. Many students would rather underperform on an exam than risk being perceived of as ignorant. So I started asking myself, how do I take what I learned about fear up in these mountains down into our everyday lives? And I've been wrestling with that question for almost 20 years now, as a college professor, as a corporate trainer and consultant, and meanwhile still mountain guiding on many weekends. And I've discovered and developed some tools that really work. And I'm on this stage today because the need for these tools is enormous. Dysfunctional groups, they're everywhere. Let's look at the business world, for example. Just like students, if employees are worried about being judged or punished for what they say or do, they'll hold back. They'll only share the ideas they feel most comfortable with. I mean, have you ever noticed that? How at meetings, people are hesitant to bring up their concerns, yet afterwards, behind closed doors, they freely do so at length? Fear. And fear impacts innovation as well. Because innovation, by its very definition, requires risk-taking, requires putting out half-baked ideas that maybe, with a little work, could be the next artificial heart, iPhone, or YouTube. Now, classrooms, workplaces, and the mountains are three very different contexts where I've experienced group dynamics. And their challenges may look different, but they feel the same. And that's why these tools to overcome these things are so universal. Now, the tools themselves aren't revolutionary. They're things you intuitively know work. But here's the challenge. There's this fascinating gap between what we know and what we do. So let's close that gap. So I'd like to start with a story of inspirational leadership. A few years ago, Volkswagen decides it's going to dominate the car market in the United States by developing a diesel engine that sips gas like a Prius, yet accelerates like a performance car. Do you know what they got? Those of you familiar with the story know. One of the largest buybacks in automotive history and an estimated loss of $30 billion with a B. Now, I owned one of those Volkswagens, and personally, I thought this buyback was awesome because I made thousands on that car. I mean, who makes money buying a car? I wish I'd owned two of those things. But truth is, I was angry at Volkswagen, and I wanted to understand why this happened. And according to New York Times reporting, the group of engineers in Germany whose job it was to create this miracle engine felt like they'd been given an impossible task. And they worried about their job so much, they collectively decided as a group it was better for them to cheat the admissions test and break the law than disappoint corporate leadership. So the root cause of the scandal? Fear. Now, academics have been studying this fear for a while, and they even have a term for it. They call it psychological safety. And the most established definition of psychological safety comes from the Harvard Business School's Amy Edmondson. And notice her definition. Look at these words: confidence, embarrass, reject, punish. These are about emotions. These are emotional words. And the end, psychological safety is about a feeling. That feeling that Barbara and I and so many others felt at Outward Bound that empowered us to be our best selves. So the question is, how do we create that feeling? This is our first tool. Now, Outward Bound does an amazing job with this. And here's one way to take it down from the mountains. You know, I spent the first 7 years of my college teaching English classes. And at first, day one, it felt like meeting with your lawyer. I mean, it had all these documents, course guide, syllabus, grading rules, policies. And then I found myself wondering why some students didn't come back for day two. I mean, right? So I threw that all out. Now day one is about relationship building. I get students talking to each other, and not about high fear topics, about low fear stuff. For example, what's your favorite restaurant? And, if you could wake up with any superpower, what would you want and why? Because once you get them talking about low fear stuff, it's so much easier to transition to the high fear stuff, where they're asking hard questions, taking risks, and giving authentic feedback. Interestingly, Google discovered the same thing. They spent 5 years and $20 million trying to perfect the perfect team. Charles Duhigg has done some fabulous reporting on it. And their methodology was to analyze the personal data of their employees. And nobody's better at finding patterns in big data than Google. And what they discovered mattered is not the stuff you would think. The number one thing that determined a team's success, regardless of what the team did, is psychological safety, is this. And that makes sense because these are fundamental human needs. So now at Google, according to Duhigg, when they have a meeting, they don't just launch right into the issue at hand. They spend a few minutes relationship building. For example, folks might share a risk they took this week. So what do these have in common? Every year, people die in avalanches. People I've known. I had a sobering close call myself. And it's really interesting. We used to think of avalanches as a physics problem. Why did the snow slide down the mountain? Now we think of avalanches as a group dynamics problem. How did a group of people incorrectly assess the risk and make bad choices? Because it turns out in most avalanche accidents, there's several common behavioral patterns. And researchers call one of those patterns the expert halo. If you perceive that somebody in your group is an expert and knows more than you, you're much more likely to not ask questions, to not express your thoughts. You hold back, just like these silent students. Looks different, feels the same. So the question is, what do we do to combat the expert halo? How do we get folks to speak up? Psychologists have an answer for us, and it comes out of research called the Asch conformity experiment. And in the experiment, they show a group of people a slide similar to this. And they ask them, which line on the right is the same length as the line on the left? Seems simple, right? But here's the trick. Everybody in the group are paid actors except for one. There's only one test subject. And these actors, they lie. The first actor says, oh yeah, number 2 is the same length as the line on the left. And the next actor goes, oh yeah, line 2. And down the line, 2, 2, 2, 2, until they get to the test subject. And then the question is, what will the test subject say? The conclusion? 32% of test subjects will conform and say number 2 as well. Stop and think about that. A third of people will publicly state something that is obviously, blatantly not true. Why? You guessed it, fear. So, interestingly, they've done variations on the test. And in one of those variations, one of the actors, just one, will tell the truth. And in that case, they found that almost all the test subjects will have the courage to say the truth as well. Conformity drops to almost 0. So here's what we need to do. Have the courage to speak your truth. When you do, you give others the courage and permission to do the same. They will follow your lead. Conformity drops to almost 0. And that responsibility lies on all of us to be that first person. And leaders, you have an especially important role here because your choices either create that culture of fear, think Volkswagen, or that culture of psychological safety and openness. So when that first person speaks up or asks that question, don't punish them. Because if you do, there won't be a second person. Instead, celebrate that person, that brave soul. Thank you, Johnny. I'm so glad you asked that question. Final tool. It seems so simple, but one of the most toxic things to group performance is to silence the voice of its members. And it happens so unconsciously. Nobody intends for the expert halo. Nobody intends for the Asch conformity effect. Nobody intends for the natural dominance of extroverts. But we've all been there, hearing Johnny talk a lot, go on and on and on. So we need to be incredibly intentional here. And one of the ways to do this is called conversational turn-taking. Some folks at Outward Bound use a talking stick. I, in class debates, often use a duct tape ball of power. Turns out the Supreme Court does the same thing. They believe in conversational turn-taking. Now, I don't know if they use a prop, but according to Justice Stephen Breyer, when they adjourn behind closed doors to deliberate a case, they have a rule. Nobody speaks twice until everyone has spoken once. And if that helps the Supreme Court decide the most controversial legal issues of our day, I guarantee it'll help at your meeting too. So stepping back, it's often said that fear is a powerful motivator. But if we stop and think about it, that's a word of caution. Because what fear motivates is holding back and poor team performance. So we need to be intentional about creating psychological safety. We need to, because our default mode is fear of judgment and punishment. Our default mode is holding back and conformity. Our default mode is a group being dominated by a few experts or extroverts or senior members. That gap between what we know and what we do, we need to close it. Personally, I'm forever grateful for my time with Outward Bound. It showed me how powerfully fear holds teams back, holds us back, holds me back. And because of the teams I've found and cultivated, my life has been filled and blessed with these amazing experiences. Climbing Denali, creating transformational experiences for students, and outfitting Buddhist monasteries in Tibet with solar and power. I invite you to do the same. Because through your power to choose which groups you belong to and influence how those groups function, you can create any life you want. The one that feels right to you. Thank you.